Our next speaker is Nanjiani, which will talk to us about alternative interpretation of fecal egg counts.
Thank you. Good morning. I hope my Scottish accent is nicely understandable to you all. What I'm talking about today is some outcomes from a 3-year project that we've been running with funding from the Veterinary Medicines Directorate and DEFRA. The overall work objective has been to look at field study and evaluate methodologies for the early detection of anthelmintic resistance stroke lack of efficacy in the English situation. That's been our reference population. The work has been done in collaboration with a couple of parasitologists, Mike Taylor and the wonderfully named Dave Burden, perfect name for a parasitologist, and a group of statisticians, including the late George Gettenby and his colleagues, Chris Robertson, Louise Kelly. And Jonathan Love is doing a PhD at the moment on statistical analysis approaches for fecal egg counting using the data sets that we've generated. So what I'm talking about today primarily is the fecal egg count reduction test, which is the backbone of the work that we conducted. It was conducted over 3 grazing seasons, and what I'm looking at today are the interpretive criteria that we're applying in our interpretation of the English system at the moment, pending the outcomes of Jonathan's PhD. Some background on the fecal egg count reduction test itself. It's in widespread use, as we've seen today, for field efficacy testing, either in the general situation or for regulatory testing. But we must remember this testing approach is unvalidated. The gold standard for parasite efficacy is to treat animals, slaughter them in a control group, chop them open, and have a wee count on a full body parasite count. Fecal egg count reduction test has never been validated against these gold standard tests. And we also need to bear in mind that the current WAAVP guidelines and a lot of common interpretation is that any lack of efficacy in this fecal egg count reduction test is interpreted as resistance. And what we're going to look at this morning is whether that's appropriate. There are many non-product factors that can affect efficacy. One of the most common ones we bump into in the UK is dose administration. It's relatively uncommon for individual animals to be dosed on the basis of their weight. There's a lot of group guesstimating going on, and certainly feedback from this project, farmers were consistently surprised when they realised how heavy their animals actually were. There are other factors too around the mechanics of the test. Specifically where your samples come from. Have they been scooped up off the floor? Have they come per rectum? And have they gone cool into the lab? Or have all your eggs hatched on the way in and you're getting a much lower count when you look down a microscope than actually is appropriate? Another key feature we evaluated was the diagnostic sensitivity that's used in the lab. And what we found was that most labs are using 50 or 100 egg per gram sensitivity for cattle fecal egg enumeration. We compared 30 egg per gram counts with 1 egg per gram counts, and we found that we could get 100% efficacy if we looked using a 30 egg per gram assay, which would drop down to 40 or 50% efficacy when we used a 1 egg per gram assay. So it's a little bit, you can only count what you can see. And then there's the question of statistical analysis. If we look in the literature, the grey literature and some of the peer-reviewed literature, there are reports of resistance out there where statistical analyses perhaps haven't been performed. And there certainly isn't strong consensus at the moment about which tests are appropriate, or most appropriate. So as we've said, this test has got its limitations. It is unvalidated. However, we have some thresholds that WAAVP have defined, which are typically used for field confirmation of efficacy studies in the field. But there's a number of assumptions in here which biologically we can question. One assumption is that the eggs coming out are directly proportional to the nematode burden within that animal. And actually we know that that's not strictly true. The egg output varies materially between different parasite species, and we can't tell the difference between the eggs when we're peering down that microscope. But equally, the egg output varies between individual animals and even within individual animals from different periods of the day or from day to day. The test also assumes that any reduction in egg count is due to the death of the adult parasite. However, we do know that many anthelmintics can cause a suspension of egg laying, so we may falsely overestimate efficacy. But the current guidance is that we use roughly 10 to 15 animals per treatment group. We use a 100 to 150 egg per gram threshold for these animals before we trigger an egg count reduction test. And what that means is that many animals that we're testing may have very low or even negative counts when they are treated. So that's our fecal egg count reduction test. But as my mother said when I was born, it's a bit ugly, it's not perfect, but it's what we've got and we're going to love it. And that's kind of where we are with the fecal egg count reduction test. So the challenge we face is the current WAAVP guidelines don't fully take account of all of these factors. So what we've been interested in is how can we look at results from egg count reduction tests and try and put them in some sort of context. Because actually WAAVP defines efficacy, and it makes the assumption if it's not efficacy, then it's resistance. Now, there's a risk therefore that we're falsely allocating farms as resistant farms when really the only way we can define that is to get some larvae off there and stick them through some decent testing. So how can we best interpret this roughly right data? So WAAVP efficacy, as I say, it's been defined. So we've got two graphs up here, and if we'll just take a little minute and orientate ourselves, up at the top of them, we've got this 95% line. So the WAAVP say that if the point estimate of efficacy, so that's the top of your bar, is above the 95% level, and the bottom of your confidence interval, so you need to do some stats to take into account the variability of the group. If you're at 95% with your bar, and if the bottom of your confidence interval is above the 90% level, you've got efficacy. Great. What about lack of efficacy? And I'm going to talk about lack of efficacy, not resistance, because we can only talk about resistance when we've done some laboratory confirmation. But again, WAAVP is saying if your point estimate is below 95% and the bottom of your confidence limit is below 90%, then you've got resistance. Great, that's nice and clear. However, the observant among you will have noticed that actually these two bars are from the same group of animals, and they've been analysed using two different statistical techniques, both of which are widely used in the literature about reporting anthelmintic efficacy. So we've got one group of cattle here which are both efficacious and resistant under the current WAAVP guidelines. So how do we make sense of that? That was really our challenge. What we've got here is one grazing season's data. And we can see there's our 95%, there's our 90%. We've got some that conform to what we would hope, but we've got some here, point estimates above 95%, but the lower confidence limit is down about 80%. Is that truly a resistant farm? We felt it was maybe a little bit bold to make that claim. So what we've set about is to try and develop some expert systems to try and interpret these. And just so that we're all clear, an unvalidated expert system is a few of us sat around a table with a cup of coffee trying to see what we think makes best sense. So we've developed these systems to aid the interpretation of these data sets in the English setup because we want to reduce the likelihood that we're misclassifying results as lack of efficacy or resistance when maybe we just don't have a clear idea on that particular farm. They were based on published literature and project team experience, and here's many of the project team at a parasite meeting with Professor Forbes as an innocent bystander in the picture. But it's largely an empirical common sense approach is what we've taken. We've taken our data and we've just analysed them statistically. We've typically been looking at efficacy, pardon me, I keep pressing the wrong button, when we've got reasonable group sizes. We're looking at a group mean of 100 eggs per gram and above using a 1 egg per gram sensitivity test. But the key thing that we're looking at is the width of the confidence interval. How precise is our estimate, and where does it fall on that bar graph that we were looking at before? We're also looking at the proportion of the group post-treatment that are shedding eggs. Is it one animal only, or is it many of them? Because if it's many of them, well, maybe there is something unusual going on that farm. And then in the second expert system, what we've also included is larval speciation data, which in this study were based on culture by treatment group. But there are now PCR technologies available that can give us some fairly reliable parasite data. We did also look at the season that were treated, but I'll skip over that just now. So we put together this chart, and essentially it's just what we've said. Expert System 1 efficacy is determined by if it falls in that golden slot that we saw earlier in our bar chart when we apply some sensible statistics to it. Suspect lack of efficacy or lack of efficacy depend on how our confidence limits are falling. If our point estimate's above 95%, but our lower confidence limit's below 90%, we're calling that suspect. If it's clearly way down, we're calling it lack of efficacy, but we're introducing an inconclusive category for those where simply there hasn't been enough statistical power in our study or on our farm to answer the question. And for our second expert system, we've done the same thing, and we've also included our speciation data. Has there been a species shift pre and post-treatment? Has there been an emergence of a specific species post-treatment? We've then applied this to our data set, which has been 2,700 animals in 88 groups up and down the length and breadth of England, from the wet 2012 summer to the dry 2014 summer. Please don't look too much at the numbers here. This is looking at the classifications according to WAAVP criteria. The key thing we're seeing here is that nearly 70% of these farms would have been classified as lack of efficacy under WAAVP rules, if you like. But how reliable is this assessment? So when we applied our first expert system, which is really looking at it from a statistical perspective only, what we find is that the majority of these lack of efficacies simply go away because there wasn't the precision in the test system to come to any meaningful conclusion about what we saw. And the relevance here is that we might be misclassifying farms as resistant, whereas actually we just haven't tested enough animals or we haven't used a sensitive enough test. When we overlaid I've got my lights flashing at me, I'm nearly there. When we overlaid the speciation data and also took into account a more detailed assessment of individual animal responses, we found we got less inconclusives, we got slightly more efficacies, and we had this category of suspect lack of efficacy. But bear in mind, this suspect lack of efficacy category had a point estimate of efficacy at 95% or above. So they're not doing too badly. We've just got quite a wide confidence interval. So, in conclusion, applying prescriptive criteria to FECRT data is very risky because this is an unvalidated test, and if we use the criteria, the WAAVP guidelines, we risk misclassifying inconclusive farms as resistant farms. If we apply some statistical rigor and we look at just the epidemiological data, we look at our parasite counts, we look at individual counts, we look at our parasite species, we can get a much more granular and much more rational interpretation of our data. So interpretation is more of an art than a science, and our aim with these data is to be roughly right and not precisely wrong. So the acknowledgements of the project team, the farmers, the laboratory staff, but also to the post office. We set the British record for the most cattle feces that have been sent through the Royal Mail. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I don't know if we have time for questions.
There's maybe time for one quick question. In front here, please.
Thank you for your presentation. Do you think that the previous management of the pasture involved in the study, that's the shedding of eggs of the animals who use the pasture before, and the treatments made on that animal, may influence the results of the fecal egg test?
Without question. We were looking at first season grazing animals, many of which were set stocked on pastures that were used sequentially year by year for first season grazing animals. And often the anthelmintic pattern was of a specific product being used consistently, so there's likely to be selection in that environment. Some of these lack of efficacy farms we followed up with a second egg count reduction test using different products to try and see if we were getting class resistance versus individual product resistance. And actually what we found in all of these farms, the egg counts post-treatment just didn't come up to a level where we could do a meaningful fecal egg count reduction second time around. So I think it does have an impact, but I suppose just to take the opportunity, these animals, regardless of how the pastures were classified in terms of resistance or efficacy, these animals all did very, very well in this English situation, which is different to, I know, many other parts of the world.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.